Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, I'm actually revisiting an ink, same as the ones for the rest of this week, but interestingly enough, this is an ink that I didn't review 2 years ago or 3 years ago. I did retest it, I think, probably like a year and a half ago, but then I recorded it and posted it really not that long. Previously, but the test had been sitting in the completed box for so long that by the time I did record it, I was like, you know what, I gotta get on this, I gotta re-review this. Now this is a DeAtramentis ink from their Famous People line, I don't know. It's Charles Dickens, aka Cement Gray. Because those of you in the know, DeAtramentis' line of famous people, doesn't matter if it's musicians or authors or whatever, they take one of their already existing inks and then slap a person or a scent in it. That's just, yeah. So this is Cement Gray, but I've only ever known it as Charles Dickens. Here you can see my lovely bottle of it. And for all of you who think that private education is better, I was taught that he had to leave school, Charles Dickens had to leave school to work in an ink making factory, and that he bottled ink, and that he had to do this to get his father out of debtor's prison. And if you read anything about the life of Charles Dickens, it's really sad, because it's a brilliant man who had to be pulled out of school to correct his father's mistakes, and he managed to sort of dig himself out of it. But yeah, my relationship to his writing, not so much. Just to clarify, he did not work in an ink bottling factory. It was shoe shine and shoe polish. He had to bottle and tin shoe polish, not ink. There's a difference. But something about, like, stained fingers, apparently wires got crossed. I don't know. So, I have actually included one of his quotes in the test. It is my favorite quote from pretty much his only work that I like. But we will get to that. I like this ink. As you can probably tell from the bottle and from the smear and whatever, it is a gray with a lot of green in it. And the reason why I liked it was because if you see some of those old fountain pen inks, especially like the grays, but also sometimes the black inks, a lot of times when people rehydrate them, they end up looking kind of like this. And I don't know, something about that kind of appealed to me. So this was actually one of the first samples of ink that I tried way back in the beginning, which was, I don't know, a whole 3 years ago. But, yeah, it stuck with me. I really liked it. However, this was one of the inks that brought along the discussion of what I have come to call DeAtramentis syndrome. What is DeAtramentis syndrome? It's my findings that the longer a DeAtramentis ink is out of its primary vessel, whether that be bottle or sample, the more aggressive the ink becomes. So, this test was intentionally done with ink that had been in pens 3 days. That is not an exorbitant amount of time, but it's also not fresh out of the bottle. So I wanted to show what sort of, like a week, wouldn't be worth testing. Fresh out of the bottle would be misleading. 3 days is not exorbitant. So, pens that I used were these. This is a Nemosine Singularity with a 0.6 stub. And as you can see, you cannot see through those tines. Those are tightly pressed together. It is dry writing. I intentionally keep it like that, so I have dry writing pens for tests. Pens for tests. English, you wouldn't guess, is my first language. Now this is a JinHao X450. Love my X450s. I'm not kidding, I have about 8 of them. And I love them because all of mine, and yes, I mean all 8, have been fairly broad and fairly wet, and good God, this one is. So, let's check out these comparisons. We got Charles Dickens, aka Cement Gray. We got Gerald's VittaR. This has a little bit more of an olive to it, it's got a little bit more of that like brown-orange color. Also quite like this ink, so long as you let it evaporate in your pen for a little bit. Next up is Noodler's Special for Dromgools of Houston, Texas Live Oak Green. This is a permanent green. This is one of those inks I love, and I can't explain why, because it is not the most well-behaved ink. Far from it. But because it has this kind of aggressive quality you see in some permanent inks, it gets kind of woolly, and so it definitely takes that effect from Charles Dickens' Cement Gray. Now, there aren't a lot of inks that are gray-green, but we have Graf von Faber-Castell's Stone Gray, which I actually really liked, and as you can probably tell, like down here, especially like up here where it's really thick, it starts to turn kind of a greenish color. Now where it's thin, it's sort of a distinct sort of pale, simple gray. But in some parts it starts to turn purpley, and then when you really lay it on heavy, it starts to turn green. Love this ink. Definitely has some green qualities. It's very different green. This is a soft, khaki green kind of. This one is very distinctly green. And lastly, probably the gray that made me fall in love with grayish greens, or greenish grays, Diamine's Graphite. Now if you see graphite next to Diamine's gray, you can definitely see the green. Next to Charles Dickens, it's harder to see. But, like even here, right next to the straight gray, you can start to see the green. Now, I had tried this before I tried Charles Dickens. I had a small bottle of this. I really liked it, so when I saw one that was even more green, I decided to check this out. So if you like graphite gray, and you like sort of like the green undertones you see in certain parts, maybe give this a try. Keep it fresh. Chromatography. Now, the one on the left, that is left, right? Yeah, left, with the D in the corner, that is the one that I let dry. It's not how you're supposed to do it, but I feel like it's taught me a lot over the years. Now what I tend to do is I put a lot of ink, do this one the way you're supposed to, which is essentially instantly drop it in the water. And then once this test is dry, usually about 8 to 10 minutes, I then dunk this one. And I do that because you can see what a difference just a little bit of time makes, just letting this dry and settle. Just a couple of minutes. But this is one of those times you can really see a difference. Now, standard. You can definitely see where that line of ink is. Yeah, this is more of a straight gray, or more of a hazy gray. Here we see a little bit of green throughout. This is not a blank band here. There is some color. We get up towards the top, we get more of this dark gray with hints of green. And then right up at the top, we start to see just little hints of this odd green color on my camera. But we just get little hints of it, and it's just right at the edge. Here, letting it dry, we see a lot of difference. Now, this line is certainly darker. You see how there are little streaks of here with dark? Here, the whole thing is that dark, and the streaks are even darker. Again, we have a very steady, clear band of resistance. Here it's a little more thready, and there's less of a separation, where here it's lighter and here much darker. Here it's sort of a steady progression till we get up to the top. And that is not your camera freaking out. This really is this weird semi-iridescent looking kind of a soft, mossy, sagey green. And because a lot of the dark stays down below, there's less of it hiding this stuff up at the top. Which is a weird, fascinating color, but this is why I do the chromatography this way. Chemical tests. Now, admittedly, this paper, this little bit of Rhodia, is not brand new. However, it actually, I feel like this gave it fairly decent results. As you can see, this water test, I just took a Q-tip, dunked the end until it was well saturated in water, and then sort of rubbed it on. Here, you can see the very steady continuation of the pattern of the smear. You see where, like, this band is a bit darker, continues. Here, this bit that's darker, continues. Because it was sort of like the chromatography, especially the dried chromatography, where this sort of soft, sagey green, sort of the vaguely gray olive started to wash away, but that gray, like we see at the band down at the bottom, remained. 1/3 bleach solution, fascinatingly, did not get rid of it. It sort of softened it, but you can still see the pattern. See this? You can see where it was heaviest. It sort of lightened it, but it didn't get rid of it. I thought that was rather fascinating. Now, ammonia pen blush started to attack the paper. You can actually see where the paper started to come apart, I think, if my camera feels like showing it today. Yeah, there. See? The ammonia started to affect the paper, started to come apart. So it sort of destroyed the paper before it could destroy the ink on the paper. And hydrogen peroxide, this is just a resistance test. I do not recommend trying to clean your pen with hydrogen peroxide. You're an independent human being. If you choose to do that, that's your own fault. I have never advocated that. But again, as you can see here, like these little bits here and here, those are paper fibers coming apart. So it started to destroy the paper before it could destroy the ink. But as these tests definitely imply, there is a component to this that is water resistant. And we also see it in the chromatography. Whether it's freshly dunked or allowed to dry for just a few minutes, there is this gray base down at the bottom. And this is actually something I've seen in a lot of DeAtramentis inks. I saw it in a purple ink. I remember seeing it in a maroon ink. A lot of them have this gray at the base that is fairly water resistant. Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. Now, this is, like, especially from this distance, and like when you don't really bring it in and there's nothing beside it to draw the attention, this looks like a gray. And then you sort of pull it in, you're a little bit closer, and you start looking, you're like, oh, it's definitely got some green in it. Which I think is kind of nice. Sort of like when people do pay attention, they start to like notice the details. But as you can see, 3 days, there definitely is a sort of woolly matte quality to it. When it's fresher, it does have a bit of a matte finish, you know, like an airbrush kind of a, not like a smooth, slick, shiny, but sort of more of a texture. And I do appreciate inks with texture. However, this matte will soon turn into woolliness. This is what I mean by DeAtramentis syndrome. Now we do have shading. This is a fun, interesting color. That small, fairly dry writing stub took 10 seconds to dry. That admittedly fairly broad and wet JinHao took 19. Now that's not a lot of dry time for something that's a 5.6 or maybe a 6 out of 10 wetness in an already wet pen, and a broad one. As I said, this ink tends to get aggressive, so the longer you leave it in the pen, the more aggressive it's going to be, which means, yeah, it might dry faster, but it's because it's fighting its way into that paper. You really need to be careful with a lot of DeAtramentis inks. As I always say, keep it fresh. Now there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, and no sheen. But this is 3 days. I almost wish I had waited and tested it again, like after a week, because I have a feeling the results would be very different. Now, this water test, as you can see, it didn't really dye the page, or if it did, definitely not a lot. But you can definitely, clearly make out this gray that remains. Is it lighter? Yes. Is it kind of like very woolly sort of textured? Yes. But that is definitely better than nothing. Next up is Fabriano Echo Qua. It's an 85 gram per square meter paper. I really love this stuff. It's my favorite. And again, when we bring it in, we can start to see more of the green. Again, we can see more of the matte finish. And especially in the scrubbies, we can really start to see the different shading and the different sort of undertones and qualities, but still has that matte finish. So yeah, that small stub took 10 seconds to dry. The broader, wetter one took 23. And we don't have any sheen, as you can see, but I don't know, I think the scrubbies really look good. It can show some of the facets of this ink. Now, there is no woolliness on here, and there is a bit of a halo effect around the darkest parts. You can see in the down line of the B in the bottom one, or the I in link. The second link, I mean. And, yeah, no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. But there is definitely some water resistance. Didn't dye the page, but that gray at the center is very clear and very there. And again, the X450, this one at the bottom, it put down more, so more remains. That is definitely better than just square one. Now, next up is Rhodia. It's an 80 gram per square meter paper. It has a ceramic coating added in the pressing process. However, this came from a very large 38 block that I had been using as a blotter. but I had been trying to find Rhodia that had been less oxygenated than the rest of the stuff that I had. I couldn't find anything that was flawless. This was the best I had at the time, and it's still not perfect. This paper was affected by environment. It aged badly. Come on. You can see it starts to feather. You look at the eyes. You start to see it. And this is what I mean by being aggressive. This ink was, or this paper was already susceptible because it had aged badly. Yeah, so something to be aware of. We still get shading. We still definitely have a woolly effect. The L. Yeah. Now, the small stub took 8 seconds to dry. The fairly brown wet JinHao took 16. And again, we can just see feathering. And yeah, it's not ideal. Now, there's no bleed, no spread, no sheen, but there is wooliness that extends into genuine feathering. And there is some echo because, again, this ink is starting to get aggressive. It's starting to fight its way into the page, and this paper being exposed to the elements, if you will, even though it's just the inside of a room, we started to get some near show through, and just to make it easier to find, I sort of circled them. Because, yeah, and then pretty much all of this. This was the edge of the block, so at a semi-aggressive getting ink with paper that was already vulnerable and then adding water, it was just asking too much, so I just wanted to point that out. So both on the back and here, the edge reacted particularly strongly. Now again, water test, it didn't dye the page, pretty much not at all here, and some remained, but it is much lighter and it is woolly, but it is there, it is clear, it didn't feather, or it didn't explode, I should say, it didn't start to just like seep out color. Now this bottom bit, as you can really tell, because suddenly a lot more remains and it's a lot darker and clearer, it's also very feathery and woolly. That's environment. Now, next up is Tomoe River. It's a cream colored paper. Now I'd say Clairefontaine and Rhodia, the two quadrilads, are more of a white. This Fabriano I'd say is more of an ivory, but this one is very distinctly cream. I do that on purpose because I want to show you how the background color of the paper can affect the ink. Now, because cream is kind of a yellow, and this ink definitely has some green undertones, this starts to look more like, where is it? Sort of more like Vert Empire. It starts to really sort of bring out the green. It is sort of like a grayish green, but it is much more noticeably green. Now, it's Tomoe River, brings out shading and sheen and dry times and echo, and here I really hope this shows up on camera. You see that? It's sort of like a faint, like brassy kind of a color. It's not gold. But yeah, so we get sheen, but it's like a hazy sheen. It's not like a distinct line the way we sometimes see. Yeah, we get a definitely distinct halo effect around the wettest parts, which is where there seems to be like a dark outline. Which I like. I think it increased contrast, makes it easier to read. Now, that small stub took 20 seconds. That broad and wet took 31. That smear is pretty significant. We do get a wide breadth of shading from where it's really thin, or, you know, laid on much more light, to where it's much more dark, where it almost starts to approach black. That's intense. Now, as I say here, dry times are longer, but that's typical for Tomoe River. There's some echo, which again is typical for Tomoe River. This is 52 grams per square meter. This stuff is thin. It's practically half the width of Clairefontaine. And this is not a light ink. I mean, it starts to look light. Here where it's laid on a bit more conservatively, shall we say. So we are going to get echo. Just, it's pretty much unavoidable. Just because this is a darkish ink and this is thinner paper, and especially where you lay it on thick at all, where we get that dark halo, there's going to be some show through. Or not show through, it is echo. It's not like it's coming through the back of the page. But yeah, this paper loves to let ink slide away when you add water. Really didn't here. Like, you can see, I'd say like 98% of all of the water that got mopped up took the ink with it. It really didn't dye the page. You can barely see where that puddle was. And yes, this is a lot lighter, and I really scrubbed that W, so that's why it looks like that. At one point I was using the Q-tip to like hold the paper down to keep the water from sliding off and going under the page. But that is very clear and very there. Even this stuff, written with the small stub, that's there. That is not just the camera. It is lighter, but it is there. It is clear. And again, the more ink you put down, the more remains. You could absolutely recover that. Now, next 3 papers, I just used the small dry writing stub, except to write the name. These are more absorbent papers. Now, this is the world's worst 20-pound paper that I've ever tried. It's the worst paper I've ever encountered. And, I mean, not counting, like, tissue paper. By which I mean, like, Kleenex. Because that... Anyways, moving on. There is definitely some spread. Like, if we compare the line with Tomoe River, and then here, this just looks like I started writing with the X450. That is some insane spread. That is some serious spread. Took 1.5 seconds to dry. Here you can definitely see woolliness. It takes on that woolly texture. It looks like yarn. And it definitely looks like furry yarn because we are getting feathers. Yeah, so we lost shading, we got spread, we've got feathers, we've got woolliness. We've got a lot of show through. I mean, this is even without me pressing it to a white background. You can almost read that. That would drive you nuts. Now, admittedly, when we bring this in close, a lot of it is very opaque. See how it's all very light? Very little of it gets dark, which means that, like, if we expanded the width of the paper, like if we zoomed in, the ink would sink in and maybe it would get very close to the back. In some places, I think it would even touch the back, but it wouldn't come through. It wouldn't start dotting the other page. So, yeah, honestly, I think if I had left the ink in this pen just a couple more days, it would be a lot worse, but more absorbent paper tends to draw the ink in, make it harder to wash out. It's definitely what we got here. And interestingly enough, it didn't dye the rest of the page. But you can tell that it's less green, which I thought was fascinating. But didn't feather, didn't explode, didn't freak out. Very legible, very clear. Didn't get a whole lot lighter. Just a bit. That's some good water resistance. Next up is Mead Notebook Paper. Very common for school children in the United States. This came from a spiral notebook, but it came from a weird one. You'll be able to tell the back is just kind of shiny. So I would have expected worse results than this. I almost feel like it couldn't bleed, which is weird, but yeah. Like a lot of Mead from a spiral notebook, it did feather a lot. Come on. Yeah, and like big, ugly, distracting feathers. Like a peacock almost. Just like big feathers everywhere. And again, we lost a lot of shading. Here it almost looked more gray. Or maybe I'm just being nuts, but yeah. We lost a lot of shading. A lot of it. It took 3 seconds to dry. There was no bleed. There is some show through because this is physically thinner than 20 pound. So considering this is already fairly dark ink. But as you can tell, everything is very, very opaque. That did not reach the other side except maybe that. And again, more absorbent papers tend to draw the ink in, make it harder to wash out. But again, this paper usually freaks out when you add water. Here, very calm. Barely dyed the page. Again, this is distinctly more gray than that, but it's very clear, very there, didn't feather, didn't explode. At least didn't feather more than already it was. That is some good water resistance. Now next up is Moleskine. I bet most of you, if I had said, like, when you feel like betting money, which paper is going to be a train wreck, this had better be the one you bet on, because train wreck. Yep. I mean, this is not just woolly, this is feathering. And this is feathering that's touching practically everything. You can see the fibers that make up the paper. There is essentially no shading. It took 4.5 seconds to dry. This is a disaster. And look at this. You know how, like, before I said, you know, like, it's fairly light, stays opaque? Here, we don't really have that. We have a million tiny dark dots. Which, again, if we were to, like, blow this up and make the paper, like, this thick, a lot of it is reaching the other side in spots. And so that is especially annoying. Like, one or two places, if you're not super picky, you can be like, ah, whatever. Here, it'd be like someone constantly poking you in the eye. It's just hideous. It's bad. And this paper, pretty much practically for the first time, the page was dyed. You can kind of see that, right? And this internal gray started to feather and explode. And just like freak out. Yeah, that's hideous, people. No. Friends don't let friends buy Moleskine. So, there you go. Retesting DeAtramentis Charles Dickens, aka Cement Gray. I actually really like this ink. I put it in a pen that I know I'm going to be writing with essentially immediately because it does age badly, like a lot of DeAtramentis inks. I do really like the color. I do really like the texture. Yeah, there are a few inks that sort of like really hit this with the like green gray. I mean, graphite is just, it's mostly gray, and Pierre is mostly green. But this is sort of this nice medium. It shades well, especially when it's fresh. Not a lot of sheen. Great water resistance on cheap papers. For your consideration from the Triple N Network, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.